A testing policy in Mississippi is being examined as a possible model for rapidly improving childhood literacy rates. Back in 2013, the Magnolia State ranked 49th in the nation for average fourth grade reading scores. 10 years and a global pandemic later, the state is now ranked 21st. For more on this, let's bring in Marcus Winters. He's a professor at Boston University. He's also the co-author of a study that took a look at the long-term impact of Mississippi's testing policy on students. Professor, what did Mississippi do differently to make these gains?
So Mississippi's adopted a really comprehensive policy to improve early literacy. They've adopted things like changing teacher training to focus more on science of reading, and provided teachers with additional supports through coaching and other supports as well. Another key aspect of the policy is that they've adopted what's called a test-based promotion policy, where in order for students to be default promoted to the fourth grade, they need to demonstrate proficiency or they reach a minimal level on the state's standardized reading test. And that's the part of the policy that I focused on, is what was the impact of being retained under that policy in Mississippi.
And what are the effects of being retained, both in terms of pedagogy? I mean, how does it help with the learning of the actual thing you're trying to learn? And then what are the psychological effects for kids at that age who might have to be held back?
Yeah, so Mississippi, the impacts of retention for early grades, I think we've seen in Mississippi and some other places some really positive impacts for very low performing students who are held back because they don't meet that minimum level. So what we find is that as late as the sixth grade, we see really large improvements in their reading proficiency relative to how they would have performed had they been socially promoted originally. Those results are actually pretty similar, at least in reading, to what we found of a similar study in Florida that adopted a similar policy in the early 2000s. The exact how this happens, I think there's a lot of ideas. The basic idea, I think, is that third grade is a really key time in the students' learning. And if you are moved on past the third grade and you're not reading sufficiently, it's much easier to fall further back. And so what we find is that students were really benefited, at least in ELA, in their reading achievement when they were held back relative to what they would have done had they been promoted.
And was there any findings, and this might have been beyond the scope of your work, but in terms of what made them catch up, was it just that developmentally, as the brain develops, they become better readers, or was there just a little more application of these new methods that made them better readers and then allowed them, after they'd been held back, to go on?
It does seem, so we don't look at the particular curriculums that they're using. And I do suspect that a lot of the other reforms that are going on in Mississippi are part of this story, that the focus on science of reading and the like. That said, it is a little bit of just acknowledging that the student is not performing well and giving them a little extra time to reach the higher levels. That's what we've seen in Mississippi, and that's what we also saw in Florida as well.
And so is it possible that this retention policy plus the training you talked about could be a model, could be replicated? And if so, what are the necessary preconditions for that replication?
I think so. I think it's still fairly early to understand the whole scope of what's happened in Mississippi, but it's certainly very promising. And as far as whether it can be expanded in other places, so Mississippi, for instance, was inspired by a series of reforms from Florida, which also had very large positive effects for kids that we've seen in prior studies. And there have been, I think there's 17 states right now that have some sort of similar policy around requiring students to meet a performance threshold in order to be moved on to the fourth grade in particular. So there definitely is ways for other states to adopt similar policies. That said, when states have adopted policies that look a little bit like this, they've varied as well. So as far as kind of where they set the standards, as far as whether it's tied to additional interventions as well, it's still early, but I think there's reason to believe that this more comprehensive approach, not just retention, but having other pieces around how we instruct teachers and what we expect for instruction in the classroom are an important part of making these policies effective elsewhere as well.
Is there anything that can be learned about the effectiveness of these policies that relates to whether it's a state level decision or a national one. And the reason I ask is because test scores have been so damaged by the pandemic. There are people seeking for national solutions to the fact that reading scores and math and history and the rest have all fallen back even further as a result of the pandemic. So what about that question of state versus national standards?
That's interesting. I think moving to a national standard has been on the radar for a long time. And I think we've moved towards that model for several years and been kind of pulling back from it. I think it's difficult for me to imagine, not just politically, but how public school funding works and the like, of having a national standard around focus on retention. That said, kind of the federal government can help to push forward initiatives around science of reading, can help to push forward increasing standards across the states in order to encourage a lot of these policies to continue to move forward as we're continuing to find positive results.
Marcus Winters, professor at Boston University, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.